How dare you! You're a freaking monster! Yeah!
I don't know. He said he shot him, but I don't know.
What if I told you the bullet that tore into Charlie Kirk's neck wasn't the most shocking part of that day? What if the real story began the moment the shooter opened his mouth and then chose silence? That's where we begin tonight. Picture it. A bright afternoon at a Utah university. A tent set up on campus, buzzing with tension. Charlie Kirk, the outspoken conservative activist and close Trump ally, steps up to the microphone. His nonprofit had organized the event, despite fierce pushback. Students had argued, petitioned, begged administrators to cancel. Nearly 1,000 signatures piled up against him. And yet, the university stood firm, invoking free speech, the First Amendment, and the noble-sounding ideals of open dialogue. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. It wasn't just another campus debate. It was a pressure cooker waiting to explode.
So there's somebody on the roof right there? Just saying. He just ran from over, where's my finger? Whoa. From over there, ran in, and now he's right there. Just saying.
Now, imagine being there. The air thick, not just with summer heat, but with unease. Some students cheering, some holding signs in protest. Police stationed discreetly in the background. Cameras rolling, phones lifted high. Everyone knew this wasn't going to be a smooth evening. But no one thought it would end the way it did. Here's where it turns chilling. Kirk,
I believe
known
in
for his
part of the essence of the
confrontational
Civil Rights Act
style,
went
was
way
asked
too
a
far, way
pointed
too
question
wide.
about
Oh,
violence,
how'd it go too far?
about the very thing that divides America like a raw wound. And in that precise moment, before he even finished responding, it happened. The crack of a rifle. A single bullet, traveling from nearly 2 football fields away, sliced through the air. It found its target. Kirk jerked back. His hand shot instinctively toward his neck. Blood. Gasps. Screams. Pandemonium. People ducked. Others froze. Security scrambled. The cameras captured it all. The moment Kirk, mid-sentence, was silenced not by debate, not by words, but by lead. But hold on. Because as shocking as that is, the bigger shock came moments later. Authorities rushed, locked down the area, and within minutes, the alleged shooter was in custody. And here's the part that should send chills down your spine. The man holding the rifle wasn't a masked extremist. He wasn't a radicalized college kid. He wasn't even middle-aged.
Well, for example,
No,
it created an
the
entire
man
civil
who
rights
pulled the
Leviathan
trigger
that
was
gave
an
us
elderly
affirmative
figure.
action.
Civil rights
Someone you might
Leviathan? What do
expect to see feeding birds at a park, not aiming through a scope. Doesn't that jar you? Doesn't it make you ask, what could drive someone in the twilight of their life to commit an act so calculated, so public, so extreme? And yet, even that wasn't the most unsettling part. The moment police subdued him, they asked the obvious question, why? And the man, frail in appearance yet cold in demeanor, uttered just 6 words. I have the right to remain silent. Think about that. He didn't scream ideology. He didn't rant about politics. He didn't even plead confusion. He invoked silence, a phrase so clinical, so rehearsed, that it felt less like panic and more like preparation. Does that sound like the words of someone acting out in a fit of madness? Or the words of someone who knew exactly what he was doing? This is where the story fractures into something far deeper. Because if the shooter's silence was deliberate, it raises terrifying questions. Was this an act of political symbolism? A personal vendetta? A test? Or was there something orchestrated behind the scenes, something we're not supposed to see? The audience that day certainly didn't see it coming. Students sobbing, hands pressed against their mouths. Protesters dropping their signs. Kirk's supporters crying out in disbelief. First responders rushing with trembling urgency. And through all that chaos, one man's refusal to explain himself cut sharper than any bullet. Now, here's where irony twists the knife. For days leading up to the event, administrators defended Kirk's right to speak. Commitment to free speech, they said. Constructive dialogue. And yet, the climax of that very debate wasn't dialogue at all. It was silence. The shooter's silence. Kirk's silencing. A grotesque mirror image of the very ideals the event was meant to showcase. Tell me, does that strike you as coincidence? Or does it feel almost scripted, as if reality itself is mocking us? And here's another layer, the timing. The shooter fired at the exact moment Kirk was answering a question about violence. Let that sink in. Kirk, the firebrand activist, defending his beliefs in front of a divided crowd, struck by violence mid-word. It's almost theatrical, almost too perfect, and that's precisely what makes it so disturbing. Think about the message it sends. To supporters, your leaders aren't safe, not even surrounded by security, not even under the banner of free speech. To opponents, protest, signatures, petitions. None of it silences like a bullet does. To America at large, the line between speech and violence has never been thinner. And the shooter? An old man, calm, calculated, silent. Doesn't that image haunt you? Ask yourself, what's more dangerous? A screaming radical we can point to, argue with, expose? Or a silent figure who refuses to give us anything, leaving us to fill the void with fear, speculation, and dread? Here's what we know. The university defended his right to speak. Students fought against it. Security thought they had the situation under control. And yet, in one crack of gunfire, everything spiraled into chaos. Here's what we don't know. Why? Why him? Why now? Why that setting, that timing, that exact question about violence? And here's the most haunting question of all. What truth lies behind the shooter's silence? Because let's be clear, silence is never empty. Silence can be a scream. Silence can be defiance. Silence can be a warning. And when an elderly man, with nothing to lose and nothing to gain, chooses silence as his first and only defense, it isn't just silence. It's a message. But a message about what? And this is where our journey tonight really begins. Because buried beneath the chaos of that day, beneath the petitions, the protests, the bullet, and the blood, is a disturbing truth nobody expected. And that truth? It's darker than anyone is prepared to admit. But to understand it, we need to go back. Back to the build-up. Back to the tensions boiling before Kirk ever stepped foot on that stage. Back to the voices that warned something terrible was coming. Because once you see that bigger picture, you'll realize this wasn't just a random act. No, this was a spark in a storm we've all been ignoring. And what comes next will make you question not just what happened in Utah, but what's happening in America. Because silence is sometimes louder than words. But what if this silence is hiding something we were never meant to hear? That's the question that will haunt us tonight. And as we dig deeper into the shooter's profile, his chilling choice of words, and the hidden cracks in America's campus debates, we'll uncover something you're not supposed to know. Something that may change how you see this entire story. And it begins right after this, when we take a closer look at the shooter himself, and why his face, his age, his silence, may be the most disturbing revelation of all. Seconds before the bullet tore through the air, Charlie Kirk's words were hanging heavy over the crowd. He was answering a question about violence, ironic, chilling, almost prophetic. And then, in the blink of an eye, violence itself answered him. Let's slow it down. Let's replay that moment, second by second, because the devil is always in the details. The tent was filled with students, staff, and outsiders. Some there in support, others in protest, all united by one thing: tension. If you watch the viral clips, you notice something eerie. The audience isn't relaxed. There's nervous laughter, the kind of laughter that masks unease. The kind of laughter people use when they're not sure if they're safe. Kirk leans forward to answer a young man's question about political violence. His tone is sharp, confident, rehearsed. He's used to these moments. He thrives on them. But then, crack. A sound so sharp it splits the air like lightning splitting a tree. At first, some thought it was a firecracker. Others thought it was a microphone malfunction. But no. A dark streak zipped across 200 yards of open space from a nearby building, directly into the exposed neck of one of the most controversial figures on American campuses today. Imagine the sound, the gasps, the screams, the scraping of chairs as people ducked and shoved, trying to understand what had just happened. 1 second, a debate about ideas. The next, a debate interrupted by blood. Do you feel the whiplash? Because that's exactly what the audience felt. Here's what eyewitnesses recall. A woman in the front row said she saw Kirk's face twist in confusion before his hand instinctively clutched his neck. Another student described the moment as a slow motion, watching Kirk stumble, his words cut off mid-sentence as blood began to flow. A supporter shouted, "Charlie's been shot," while others screamed and dropped to the ground. And yet, In the middle of this chaos, some froze. Some students didn't move, paralyzed by the shock of what they'd just witnessed. Have you ever been in a moment where your body doesn't respond, even though danger is screaming at you to run? That's what witnesses described, frozen fear. Security officers leapt into action. They pushed through rows of chairs, yelling for people to get down, get out, stay calm. But how do you stay calm when you've just seen a man collapse, blood dripping from his neck, while the crack of a gunshot still echoes in your ears? Phones fell. Signs were abandoned. Protesters who'd been shouting minutes earlier were now silent, faces pale, eyes wide. Some supporters began to pray aloud. Others filmed, trembling, capturing history in shaky frames. And the timing, the precise timing, is what makes this moment unforgettable. Charlie Kirk had been speaking about violence, about the dangers of political tension, about how America needs dialogue, not destruction. And then, destruction itself arrived, mid-sentence. Isn't that almost theatrical? Doesn't it feel like something out of a film, scripted by fate, designed to send a message louder than any words? Now think about this. The bullet came from 200 yards away. That's no easy shot. That requires planning, patience, precision. Whoever pulled that trigger wasn't acting on impulse. That wasn't a spur-of-the-moment rage. That was someone lying in wait, someone who chose that moment deliberately. And that's what makes this chapter of the story so haunting. Because if the shooter had waited for Kirk to finish, or fired at a random point in his speech, maybe we'd call it coincidence. But no, the shot rang out at the exact moment Kirk was talking about violence. It's as though the shooter wanted to silence him, not just physically, but symbolically. Doesn't that make you wonder? Was this about Charlie Kirk as a man, or Charlie Kirk as a message? Because let's be clear, this wasn't just about one man bleeding on a stage. It was about the clash of two Americas. On one side, the students who petitioned to block him, who saw his presence as dangerous, divisive, a spark that could ignite unrest. Nearly 1,000 signatures collected, a digital army pushing against his appearance. On the other side, the university, standing by the Constitution, insisting that free speech must prevail, even when that speech divides. And caught in the middle, a campus community, forced to grapple with ideas bigger than themselves. And then, gunfire. Violence doesn't argue. Violence doesn't debate. Violence doesn't sign petitions or write statements. Violence silences. And in that moment, Charlie Kirk was silenced. But here's where it turns even darker. Because as Kirk fell back, as chaos erupted, as the crowd screamed, one thought spread like wildfire. Who did this?
Okay, well,
was it a protester?
I appreciate
Was
that.
it an
I
extremist?
don't like you as much as Charlie,
Was it a
though.
student radicalized by politics? Every face turned suspicious. Every voice raised in panic. Trust evaporated instantly. And then the announcement came. Security had the shooter. He wasn't a student. He wasn't a masked radical. He was an elderly man. Let that sink in. You're standing in a crowd, convinced some fiery activist pulled the trigger, only to discover it was a man old enough to be someone's grandfather. Doesn't that jar you? Doesn't that shatter the picture we all expected? Here's the truth about that day. The bullet hit Kirk, but the shockwave hit the entire country. Because if even an elderly man can become a shooter, what does that say about where we are as a society? And here's where we leave Chapter 1, with the question that still lingers, unanswered. Because while Kirk was rushed to safety, while blood stained the stage, while cameras captured the chaos, the man who pulled the trigger wasn't shouting slogans, wasn't ranting ideology, wasn't confessing. He was waiting quietly, as if the bullet had already said everything he needed to say. But what came next, the first words out of his mouth, would prove even more disturbing than the gunshot itself. And no one saw it coming. He didn't look like a shooter. He didn't look like the kind of man who could send hundreds fleeing in terror, or the kind of man who could bring one of America's most polarizing activists to his knees with a single crack of a rifle. No, when his face was revealed, when the truth came out, jaws dropped for an entirely different reason. The man who fired at Charlie Kirk wasn't a militant youth, wasn't a masked extremist, wasn't a radicalized student. He was elderly, white hair, weathered skin, the sort of frame that spoke more of frailty than fury. Someone you'd expect to see in line at the pharmacy. Someone you might hold the door open for at the grocery store. Someone's grandfather. And yet, here he was, cuffed, held down by police. A rifle traced back to him. Doesn't that feel wrong? Doesn't it feel like a contradiction that demands explanation? Because let's be honest, when we hear about shootings at political rallies, our minds jump to certain stereotypes. We think of angry young men, faces twisted with rage, filled with a sense of purpose or hatred that propels them to violence. But this was the complete opposite. So who was he? Reports identified him as an elderly man who lived not far from the university. Neighbors described him as quiet, ordinary, kept to himself. Isn't that what they always say? The ordinary mask that hides something extraordinary. And here's where it gets unsettling. This wasn't some senile slip of judgment. This wasn't confusion. This man waited. He positioned himself in a building, scoped his target across 200 yards, and timed his shot to coincide with Kirk speaking about violence. That isn't random. That isn't a mistake. That's deliberate. Which forces us to ask, what drives an older man, someone in the later years of life, someone with more days behind him than ahead, to pick up a weapon and commit an act like this? Is it ideology? Is it bitterness? Is it the slow build of resentment, the accumulation of grievances over decades, finally snapping in one violent act? Or is it something darker? Let's pause here. Think about the symbolism. Youth is often associated with change, rebellion, radicalism. Old age is supposed to represent wisdom, perspective, calm. But in this story, the roles are reversed. The students protested with signatures, petitions, and chants. The elderly man answered with a rifle. Doesn't that inversion strike you as strange? Doesn't it make you wonder if the roles of protest and violence have been flipped in ways we can't quite process? Eyewitnesses described their shock not just at the shot, but at the shooter. One protester said, "When I saw his face, I couldn't believe it. He looked like someone who should have been telling us stories, not pulling a trigger." Another added, "It didn't make sense. I thought it was a student. We all thought it was a student." And maybe that's why his age is the most chilling part of this story, because it breaks the narrative we expect. It unsettles us more than a stereotypical radical would. It forces us to confront a deeper question. Violence has no age limit. But here's where the story tilts even further into the disturbing. When the officers pinned him down, when they asked him to explain himself, he didn't launch into a tirade. He didn't wave a manifesto. He didn't scream about politics or ideology. He looked them in the eye and said the words, "I have the right to remain silent." That's it. 6 words. Cold. Deliberate. Practiced. Now, let's be clear. Every American has that right. It's part of the Miranda warning, the backbone of our legal system. But doesn't the timing strike you as eerie? The very first words he chose weren't about guilt, weren't about innocence, weren't even about remorse. They were about silence. And silence, in this case, is deafening. Because here's the contradiction. If this man was so passionate, so driven, so desperate to act, why stop speaking the moment the act was over? Why let the bullet be his only voice? That choice has led to endless speculation. Was he trying to protect someone else? Was he working with others, instructed to keep quiet? Or was the silence itself the point, an act of defiance, a message louder than words? Ask yourself, what's more terrifying, a man screaming his ideology, or a man who refuses to explain himself at all? Here's another detail that makes this even stranger. Witnesses who saw him being led away noted how calm he appeared. Not panicked, not distraught, not triumphant. Calm, almost resigned. Like a man who had rehearsed this moment in his mind 1,000 times. Like a man who knew what he was doing and was content to let the silence speak for him. And that's what makes Chapter 2 so disturbing. This wasn't the act of a young extremist with years of online radicalization. This wasn't the rage of someone in the prime of life, desperate to prove themselves. This was the act of a man whose life should have been winding down. A man who should have been reflecting, slowing, fading. Instead, he chose to end his story with blood and silence. Doesn't that force you to question the easy answers? Doesn't it make you wonder if there's something we're missing? Because if an elderly man can carry out a shooting like this, then maybe it isn't just about one man's ideology. Maybe it's about something bigger. A sickness in the culture. A silence that's been building, festering, waiting to explode. And the fact that he chose not to explain himself? That's the most chilling part of all. Because silence invites us to fill the gaps. And when we fill those gaps with fear, with suspicion, with speculation, that's when the story takes on a life of its own. And that's exactly what happened. As the man was led away, Kirk was rushed to medical care, and the campus erupted into panic. But the shooter's silence left a vacuum. And into that vacuum poured theories, rumors, and whispers. But one thing stood out, louder than all the speculation. If this man was silent, his past might not be. His history could hold the key. And when investigators began digging into his background, they uncovered threads that only deepened the mystery. Threads that suggested this wasn't as random as it first appeared. Threads that might reveal the disturbing truth nobody expected. But to see that, we need to go deeper. Because his silence wasn't the answers. They're darker than anyone imagined. I have the right to remain silent. 6 words. Cold. Simple. Delivered with the calmness of a man who had just planned his last act on Earth. That was all the shooter said. Nothing more. No explanation. No justification. Just silence. And yet, that silence was louder than the gunshot itself. Think about it. We expect shooters, when caught, to say something: anger, delusion, an excuse. Something that lets us fit the act into a neat box labeled madness, or politics, or revenge. But this was different. This was restraint. This was strategy. This was someone who didn't want to be understood. Now here's the disturbing part. The phrase itself, "I have the right to remain silent," isn't random. It's legal. It's technical. It's part of the Miranda warning, a phrase every American knows from movies and TV. But what does it mean when the very first words out of a shooter's mouth aren't human, emotional words, but legal ones? Doesn't it sound rehearsed? Doesn't it feel like he was waiting for that exact moment? And ask yourself this: who rehearses silence? Investigators immediately clocked the peculiarity. Was the man invoking his rights? Or was he delivering a message? Because sometimes silence isn't emptiness, it's resistance. It's defiance. It's a wall between truth and exposure. We've seen this before, haven't we? Famous figures, from mob bosses to political operatives, clamping their mouths shut as if silence could shield them. And sometimes it does. Silence buys time. Silence sows mystery. Silence turns a man into a riddle. And riddles are more dangerous than answers. Because when someone refuses to speak, we start speaking for them. We fill the void with our own fears, our own theories, our own darkest suspicions. And that's exactly what happened in the hours after the shooting. Some believed his silence was guilt, that he was hiding ties to a larger movement, an underground network waiting to act again. Others thought it was shame, that he didn't want to face the world with his motives exposed. And then there were those who saw it as power, that by saying nothing, he forced everyone else to say everything. Which do you believe? Here's where it gets chilling. The shooter's silence contrasted with the noise around him. Sirens blaring, students screaming, journalists shouting questions. And in the middle of that storm, he sat silent. Doesn't that image disturb you? An old man, stone-faced, refusing to break, while the world demanded answers he would not give. Let's look deeper. Was his silence meant to protect himself or someone else? Consider this. Silence can shield co-conspirators. If you don't speak, you don't implicate anyone. You don't confirm or deny. You give nothing. That's power. That's control. And in a way, the shooter controlled the narrative not by speaking, but by refusing to. And that's why his first words matter so much. I have the right to remain silent. They weren't just about law. They were about dominance. About saying, I'm in charge of what you know. You can cuff me. You can interrogate me. You can parade me on camera. But you will not hear the truth unless I decide you will. Doesn't that feel calculated? And yet, there's another possibility. Maybe his silence wasn't control. Maybe it was fear. Maybe he was afraid that if he spoke, he would reveal too much. Maybe he was terrified of betraying something bigger, something connected. Ask yourself, was his silence a shield or a signal? Because here's the irony. While the man refused to speak, his silence spoke volumes. It raised questions about his motives, his past, his ties. And investigators knew they couldn't rely on his words. They had to dig into his life instead. And what they found only deepened the mystery. Neighbors who described him as quiet. Friends, if you could call them that, who said he'd grown bitter over the years. Online traces hinting at disillusionment, at anger simmering under the surface. But nothing concrete. Nothing that screamed, here's your reason. And so the silence remained. But here's where it gets even darker. Silence can be a strategy, but it can also be a confession. By refusing to explain himself, The shooter left the impression that his motives were too dangerous to reveal. That maybe the truth, if spoken aloud, would shake people even more than the bullet itself. Doesn't that possibility haunt you? Think about the timing again. Kirk was asked about violence. He was answering passionately, forcefully. And then the bullet hit. Kirk was silenced in that moment. And minutes later, the shooter, when asked to explain, chose silence. A symmetry too chilling to ignore. Both men silenced, one by blood, one by choice. Coincidence? Or message? And here's where the story tilts into disturbing territory. Because if it was a message, what was it? Was it a statement about free speech? About silencing voices? About the futility of dialogue in a country tearing itself apart? Or was it something simpler, something more personal, less grand, but just as devastating? We don't know. Because he won't say. And maybe that's the point. Because silence forces us to wrestle with questions that never get answered. And in America today, those unanswered questions are dangerous. They breed conspiracy. They breed mistrust. They breed division. And maybe that was his goal all along. But silence doesn't erase the past. And if the shooter wouldn't speak, his life might. So investigators turned to his history, his records, his movements, his connections. And what they began to uncover suggested that this wasn't an isolated act of madness. It was the end point of something long, something hidden, something that had been building for years. And what they found, that's where the disturbing truth begins to surface. Because silence can only hide so much. And when you peel back the layers of this man's past, what emerges is something far more terrifying than anyone expected. And what investigators discovered next will make you wonder whether the silence was protection or prophecy. It started long before the gunshot. Before Charlie Kirk even stepped foot on that stage, the university campus was already boiling with tension. You could feel it in the air. A debate wasn't just scheduled, it was dreaded. Posters went up. Students whispered in lecture halls. Professors debated in faculty lounges. And when the announcement was made that Kirk, one of America's most polarizing conservative voices, would be allowed to speak on campus, that's when the fuse was lit. Nearly 1,000 students signed an online petition demanding the event be canceled. We don't want hate on our campus. Free speech is not a free pass for dangerous rhetoric. Kirk brings division, not dialogue. Those were some of the phrases echoing through the digital halls of dissent. But the university said no. Administrators issued a statement invoking the First Amendment. Our institution is committed to free speech, intellectual inquiry, and constructive dialogue. A noble stance on paper, a sharp rebuke to the petitioners. But in reality, it was gasoline poured on an already smoldering fire. And the students felt it. Some were outraged. Some were terrified. Others rolled their eyes, muttering, "This is exactly what they want. Controversy, chaos, attention." Doesn't that sound familiar? Haven't we seen this script before? A controversial figure invited. Protests mounted. The administration clinging to free speech ideals. And somewhere, lurking in the shadows, violence waiting for its cue. Now picture the scene days before the event. Students sitting cross-legged on the quad, holding signs reading, "No platform for hate," and "Not in our name." A countergroup forming nearby with their own signs. "Free speech for all," and "You can't silence us." The chants rising, clashing, colliding like waves in a storm. Faculty meetings were no calmer. Some professors backed the petition, warning of safety risks. Others stood by the administration, saying universities should be battlegrounds for ideas, not echo chambers. And yet, beneath their principled arguments was a shared unease. Everyone knew this wasn't going to end quietly. And here's where the chilling part creeps in. Some warned explicitly of violence. "This is dangerous," one student leader said. "You're inviting chaos." Another wrote in a campus forum, "If something happens, the administration will have blood on its hands." Think about that. A warning sounded days before. A warning ignored. And then came the day of the event. The atmosphere was electric, but not in a celebratory way. Protesters lined the entrance, their chants filling the air. Supporters countered, waving American flags, shouting back. Police stood between the two groups, eyes darting, hands hovering near radios. Inside the tent, the tension was no less palpable. Some attendees sat with folded arms, ready to grill Kirk with tough questions. Others sat on the edge of their seats, eager to cheer him on. And in the middle, a stage, a microphone, and one man about to step into the crossfire of words. Now pause for a moment. Imagine you're Kirk, walking onto that stage. You know half the crowd despises you. You know 1,000 students wanted you banned. You know administrators defended your right to speak only under heavy criticism. And you know the moment you open your mouth, everything you say will be recorded, dissected, attacked, defended. That's the environment Kirk entered. And doesn't it feel like the perfect storm? Because here's the contradiction that haunts this chapter. Free speech was defended, but free speech also created the conditions for chaos. By insisting Kirk had the right to speak, the university also made him a target. A target of outrage, a target of protest, and, chillingly, a target of a bullet. So we have to ask, did the university's commitment to free speech, noble as it was, unintentionally open the door to tragedy? Because here's the irony. They wanted dialogue. They wanted debate. They wanted an event where ideas clashed, not fists or bullets. But what they got was blood on a microphone and screams in the night. And the petitions? They became prophetic. The signatures weren't just digital protests. They were warnings. Please, 1,000 voices shouting, something bad will happen. And something bad did. Isn't it strange how hindsight makes everything sharper? When we look back, the signs were there all along. The protests, the anger, the warnings of violence, the administrator's choice to push forward anyway. And yet, when the shot rang out, everyone said the same thing. We never expected this. But that's not true, is it? Because some did expect it. Some feared it. Some predicted it. They just weren't listened to. Now here's where the story tilts. Because the tension wasn't just about Kirk, or free speech, or student petitions. It was about something deeper. The cultural war bleeding into every corner of American life. A war where universities, once temples of thought, have become battlegrounds of ideology. And in battlegrounds, words aren't always enough. Sometimes, tragically, violence follows. But here's what makes this story even more haunting. The university didn't just defend Kirk's right to speak. Behind closed doors, they were warned. They knew the risks. They had been told the danger. And yet, they moved forward. And when the bullet flew, when Kirk collapsed, when chaos erupted, those warnings came back like ghosts. Because free speech may be a principle, but principles don't bleed. People do. And in the aftermath, administrators would be forced to face a chilling truth. Their decision may have been noble, but it may also have opened the door to a nightmare they can never close. But what came next? What investigators uncovered about what happened behind those closed doors in the days before the event would reveal just how chilling those warnings really were. And no one on that campus was prepared for it. They thought the statement would protect them. They thought it would be their shield. But instead, it became the very thing that haunts them now. Days before the event, the university released its official position. It was polished. It was principled. It was the kind of message administrators dream of when trying to please everyone while pleasing no one. It read, "Our institution remains committed to free speech, intellectual inquiry, and constructive dialogue. We believe all voices deserve to be heard, even those we may disagree with." Noble, isn't it? Classic. The kind of rhetoric that sounds good in a courtroom, in a mission statement, or on the glossy pages of a university brochure. But in reality, that statement was dynamite wrapped in gift paper. Because to Kirk's supporters, it sounded like vindication. Proof that free speech still lived, even in the face of opposition. But to his critics, those 1,000 students who signed petitions, it felt like betrayal. Like their safety, their voices, their warnings were tossed aside in the name of principle. And here's the chilling twist. Some students didn't just see the statement as misguided. They saw it as dangerous. One student leader, furious, told local media, "The university is hiding behind free speech while ignoring the reality of what this man brings. They're inviting chaos." Another said, "This isn't about free speech. This is about safety. And the administration has chosen ideology over lives." Harsh words, yes, but hindsight makes them prophetic. Because days later, the blood of Charlie Kirk would prove them right in ways no one wanted. Doesn't that strike you? The irony? The same statement meant to reassure became a forecast of disaster. Now let's dig deeper. Behind the scenes, administrators weren't as calm as their public statement suggested. Emails circulated. Emergency meetings were called. Security briefings stretched into late hours. Some faculty pushed the administration, demanding they cancel. They cited threats. They cited petitions. They said bluntly, "You're taking a risk you can't control." But the administration doubled down. The First Amendment protects this event. We cannot censor based on popularity. Universities must stand as neutral platforms. It sounds good. It sounds principled. But here's the problem. Principles don't bleed. People do. And that's what makes this so chilling. Administrators chose ideals over instinct. They chose doctrine over the pounding warnings of reality. Think about it. Nearly 1,000 voices told them, "Don't do this." Students were anxious. Faculty raised alarms. Protesters warned of tension. And still, the event went forward. Because in their eyes, canceling would be surrender. Canceling would be weakness. Canceling would be censorship. But what is the line between bravery and recklessness? Because when the shot rang out, when Charlie Kirk clutched his neck, when students screamed and chaos erupted, the university's noble words collapsed under the weight of blood. And here's the most haunting irony. The university defended Kirk's right to speak, but in the end, his voice was silenced, not by administrators, not by protesters, but by violence. By a bullet. By the very thing Kirk had been asked about at the moment of impact. Isn't that a cruel twist of fate? Now let's peel back another layer. Some insiders whispered that administrators were warned specifically about threats, that certain individuals on campus had made alarming statements online, that the possibility of violence wasn't just abstract, it was real, it was imminent, and it was ignored. We don't know yet how much the university truly knew. But we do know this. When institutions insist on principles without considering consequences, tragedy isn't far behind. And tragedy arrived. The press later grilled the university. Did you take safety seriously? Were warnings ignored? Do you regret allowing the event? The answers were predictable. We mourn with the community. We stand by our principles. We will cooperate fully with the investigation. Carefully crafted words. Empty comfort. But here's the truth no statement can cover. They gambled. And they lost. They gambled that Kirk would speak, students would protest, tempers would flare, but no real harm would come. They gambled that the noble language of free speech would be enough to shield them from danger. They gambled that warnings were just noise, not prophecy. And when the bullet tore into Kirk's neck, that gamble shattered in front of the world. Doesn't that make you ask, who bears responsibility? The shooter, yes. Always. But what about the system that ignored the signs? What about the administrators who chose principle over protection? What about the voices silenced before the gunshot? The 1,000 students who tried to stop this before it began? Responsibility doesn't fall in one place. It ripples. And those ripples will haunt this university for years. Because this wasn't just about Kirk. This was about the failure to listen. The failure to weigh principle against danger. The failure to recognize that free speech without safety is a ticking time bomb. And here's the cruelest part. The administrators believed their statement would protect them from criticism. But in the aftermath, that very statement became their indictment. Every word reread, every line re-examined, every phrase turned into a reminder of what they ignored. And now, their noble defense of free speech will forever be tied to bloodshed on their campus. But what came next would only deepen the nightmare. Because when investigators turned from the university to the shooter himself, what they uncovered wasn't random. It wasn't senseless. It was far darker. And it suggested that this tragedy wasn't just about free speech at all. It was about a man with a history, a disturbing one, that no one saw coming. What drives a man to pick up a rifle at the age when most are slowing down, watching grandchildren play, or tending gardens? What fuels an act so deliberate, so cold, so violent? That's the question investigators faced when they turned their attention to the shooter. His age alone raised eyebrows. Elderly shooters are rare, almost unheard of. Yet here was a man in the twilight of his life, lying in wait 200 yards away, firing on Charlie Kirk at the exact moment he spoke about violence. Coincidence? Or something far more deliberate? Let's break this down. 3 motives floated immediately to the surface: political, personal, and symbolic. Each as chilling as the next. First, the political angle. Charlie Kirk isn't just any speaker. He's a lightning rod, a staunch conservative, a Trump ally, a man whose words ignite fury as much as they inspire loyalty. To his supporters, he's a warrior for free speech. To his critics, he's a danger, a peddler of division. So ask yourself, is it really so unthinkable that someone might see Kirk not as a person, but as a target? Nearly 1,000 students had already signed petitions against his appearance. Protesters had lined the entrance. The event wasn't just controversial, it was combustible. The shooter, elderly though he was, could have absorbed years of anger, bitterness, and resentment, all of it culminating in that single, horrifying act. But here's the twist. If his motive was purely political, why stay silent? Why not shout a manifesto? Why not rant about ideology? Why not leave no doubt about the why? That silence suggests something deeper, something more calculated, which brings us to the second possibility. Could Kirk have represented something more than politics to the shooter? Could Kirk have been a symbol of all the anger, all the bitterness, all the perceived betrayals the man carried? Sometimes shooters don't aim at individuals. They aim at what those individuals represent in their own private storms. Neighbors later described the shooter as quiet, reclusive, strange at times. One even mentioned he'd grown increasingly bitter over the years. Was this bitterness personal? Did Kirk simply become the vessel for a storm the shooter could no longer contain? It's possible. But again, why silence afterward? And that leads us to the third and most unsettling angle, symbolism. Consider the timing. Kirk was answering a question about violence. At that exact moment, the shooter fired. A bullet, silencing speech. Words, cut short by violence. Do you see the symmetry? Doesn't it feel almost theatrical? What if the silence was an absence? What if it was the message? The shooter's first words, "I have the right to remain silent," were not just legal jargon. They were a continuation of the act. Kirk's silence by the bullet. The shooter's silence by choice. Both sides of America's political divide, speech and silence, words and weapons, collapsing into one chilling scene. Isn't that almost too perfect? Almost as though it was designed to send a message that dialogue itself is dead. But here's the darker question. If the shooter meant his silence as symbolism, what does that say about the future? What happens when people stop talking and start shooting? When silence becomes the ultimate weapon? Investigators knew they had to dig deeper. Because silence couldn't be the end of the story. They needed to know if this man acted alone, or if he was part of something larger. They combed through his past. Public records, employment history, online activity, medical files, anything that could shed light on why an elderly man would commit such a violent act. And the fragments they found painted a disturbing picture. Financial struggles, isolation, health issues, a man who felt forgotten, left behind, unheard. Can you see how resentment might fester there? How disillusionment might twist into something darker? But there was more. Investigators found traces, comments online, attended meetings, hints of political disillusionment. Nothing overt, nothing enough to label him an extremist. But the patterns were there. A man angry at the system. A man tired of being ignored. A man who chose one final, violent way to be heard, by not speaking at all. And that's where the motive may lie. Not politics alone. Not personal grievance alone. But something symbolic. A statement made not in words, but in action. A message carried in silence, echoing louder than any manifesto could. But here's where it turns even darker. If his silence was the message, then what exactly was he trying to tell us? Was he saying free speech is futile? That words are meaningless in the face of violence? That America's divisions have reached the point where bullets answer questions better than dialogue? Or was it something more cryptic, something investigators haven't yet pieced together? Because silence leaves space. And into that space, every theory can fit. Every fear, every suspicion. And that may have been the point all along. But one thing investigators did agree on: this wasn't random. This wasn't an accident. This was deliberate, planned, timed, and chillingly precise. And when they uncovered more about his background, his past interactions, his history of bitterness, and the strange clues left behind, it became clear this shooting wasn't just an isolated moment. It was the final chapter of a disturbing story that had been building for years. And the revelations that followed would shake not just the campus, but the entire nation. Because when you realize who this man really was, the disturbing truth becomes impossible to ignore. And what investigators discovered next will make you wonder whether the silence was hiding something we were never supposed to hear. The shooter's past didn't scream violence. It whispered it, quietly, subtly, the kind of whispers you only hear once tragedy has forced you to listen. Let's start with his background. He'd lived in the same modest home for years. A quiet residential street. Neat lawns, mailboxes lined up like soldiers, the hum of suburban life. He blended in. Retired. Elderly. Some described him as nice enough. Others said he was odd, but harmless. Isn't that always how it goes? But behind closed doors, there was another story. Divorce papers years earlier. Estranged family. Financial hardship. A health decline that left him bitter, aching, angry at the body that was betraying him. Small cracks in a man's life that, left unattended, widened into chasms. And then there were the traces online. Investigators uncovered comments left on obscure forums. Posts laced with frustration at politics, at the country, at younger generations. Resentment aimed at universities, places he once admired but now despised as indoctrination factories. He had written about frauds with microphones and children pretending to know history. Doesn't that sound chillingly familiar? Doesn't it sound like a man who would see Charlie Kirk not just as a person, but as a symbol of everything he loathed? But here's where it gets strange. His online footprint wasn't loud. It wasn't the rants of a radical drowning in digital echo chambers. It was scattered, sporadic, almost as if he was testing the waters, but pulling back before he revealed too much. And that raises a question. Was he truly isolated, or was he hiding in plain sight? Investigators dug deeper. Old acquaintances came forward. Some remembered his bitterness, his growing paranoia. One said he had become obsessed with the state of the country. Another claimed he spoke often about being silenced. Isn't that telling? A man who feared silence became a man who weaponized silence. And here's the most unsettling part. He had once been active. He'd attended community meetings years ago. He had written letters to local officials. He had tried to be heard. But over time, his efforts dwindled. His letters stopped. His presence faded. And in that fading, resentment grew. He wasn't just ignored. He was forgotten. And when people feel forgotten, they often seek the loudest way to be remembered. Doesn't that sound like a motive? Now add another layer. Medical reports hinted at health struggles, declining eyesight, chronic pain, possible cognitive issues. Combine that with isolation, financial strain, and bitterness, and you have a recipe for disillusionment. But here's the contradiction. If this was just personal bitterness, why target Kirk? Why not lash out closer to home? Why not strike at those directly connected to his struggles? That's why investigators began to believe this wasn't just about the man's life. It was about what Kirk represented. Youth, politics, power. A voice amplified while his own had been silenced by age, by circumstance, by society. And maybe that's why his silence after being detained was so haunting. It wasn't just a legal move. It was the culmination of years of being ignored. His final statement, "You didn't listen before, and you won't hear me now." But silence doesn't erase the past. And as investigators pieced together his story, a disturbing pattern emerged. Moments of anger at public meetings. Strange mutterings overheard by neighbors. A fascination with guns in his younger years. Nothing dramatic enough to raise alarms. But when viewed in hindsight, they painted the picture of a man inching toward darkness. And that's the most terrifying part of all. Because how many other men like him are out there right now? Quiet, bitter, forgotten, slipping through the cracks until one day, they don't slip, they explode. The shooter's past didn't explain everything, but it did reveal one thing. This act wasn't sudden. It wasn't random. It was years in the making. Years of silence. Years of anger. Years of being overlooked until the only way he thought he could be heard was with a bullet. And that's why investigators knew they had to keep digging. Because if his past hinted at resentment, his connections might reveal something darker. Something organized. Something more than just one man with a rifle. And what they uncovered next, his strange interactions, his hidden ties, and the chilling possibility that he wasn't acting entirely alone, would take this story from tragic to terrifying. And nobody saw it coming. Charlie Kirk didn't stumble into controversy. He built his career on it. And that's what makes Chapter 8 so crucial. Because to understand why an elderly man pulled a trigger from 200 yards away, you need to understand who Kirk is, what he represents, and why his presence on that campus wasn't just an event. It was a spark in a powder keg. Let's strip it back. Charlie Kirk isn't just a conservative commentator. He isn't just another right-wing activist. He's the founder of Turning Point USA, a nonprofit that has become one of the most aggressive conservative organizations targeting America's youth. His mission? To plant conservative ideas in universities, territories often dominated by liberal voices. Think about that strategy. Going into enemy territory. Walking into campuses where he knows half the crowd despises him, where administrators are pressured to cancel him, where protesters wait outside. And yet, he thrives there. He wants the conflict. He wants the opposition. Because for Kirk, outrage isn't a cost, it's currency. And it works. Every time students protest him, every time administrators are forced to defend his right to speak, every time media headlines scream, controversial speaker draws outrage, his brand grows. He positions himself not just as a voice, but as a fighter, a man willing to stand in the firestorm of cancel culture and not flinch. Do you see the irony? That very firestorm may have drawn the bullet. Kirk's ties to Donald Trump only deepen his symbolism. He's not just conservative, he's Trumpian. Loyal to the former president, echoing his rhetoric, defending his legacy. To supporters, that makes him a warrior. To critics, it makes him dangerous. And on a campus already divided, those ties made him a target the moment his appearance was announced. Now, let's add another layer. Kirk's style. He doesn't tiptoe. He doesn't soften his words to fit academic settings. He goes in sharp, confrontational, sometimes mocking. He relishes in pushing buttons, in sparking outrage, in forcing audiences to react. And students, passionate, idealistic, outspoken, react exactly as he wants. They shout back. They protest. They petition. And suddenly, the debate isn't about ideas anymore. It's about Kirk himself. And maybe that's the key. Maybe the shooter didn't see Kirk as a man at all. Maybe he saw Kirk as a symbol, a lightning rod, a living, breathing embodiment of everything he despised in politics, in America, in his own life. Because let's be honest, Kirk wasn't chosen randomly. The shooter didn't fire into the crowd. He didn't aim at police. He aimed at the man with the microphone, the man with the power, the man who had turned free speech into a weapon, who had walked into the storm and dared anyone to stop him. Doesn't that choice tell you everything? Kirk represented the new America, loud, polarized, divided into camps that no longer debate but destroy. And the shooter, an elderly man, represented the old America, bitter, forgotten, silent. That collision on the university stage wasn't just chance. It was metaphor. Now let's consider something chilling. Kirk's critics often say he thrives on division, that he wants conflict because conflict fuels his message. And in many ways, they're right. Every protest, every petition, every attempt to silence him becomes proof that he's fighting the establishment. He wears outrage like armor. But here's the catch. When outrage turns violent, that armor shatters. He was answering a question about violence when violence answered him. Can you imagine a more haunting twist of fate? And here's where it gets even more disturbing. Kirk has built his career on the idea that free speech must be defended at all costs. But that day, his speech was literally cut off by a bullet. Doesn't that strike you as a grotesque irony? A man who fights for the right to speak silenced by violence in the very moment he exercised that right. For his supporters, that makes him a martyr of free speech. For his critics, it raises unsettling questions about whether ideas this polarizing can ever be safely debated in public spaces. And for the nation, it forces us to ask, how far gone are we when words and bullets collide on a university campus? Now let's return to the shooter. Why Kirk? Why that event? Why that day? Because Kirk wasn't just giving a speech. He was giving a debate, a confrontation. He was walking into the very arena where ideological battles rage hottest. And the shooter chose that arena as his stage too. A stage not of words, but of silence. A stage where one bullet carried more weight than 1,000 signatures on a petition. And maybe that's the point. Maybe the shooter wasn't just attacking Kirk. Maybe he was attacking what Kirk represented. The collision of free speech and outrage, of politics and performance, of America's deep divide. And that's why investigators had to dig deeper, not just into Kirk's role, but into the shooter's choice. Because symbolism this sharp is rarely random. But the most haunting detail wasn't Kirk's presence, or his ties to Trump, or even his style of confrontation. It was the moment, the exact second when words about violence were replaced with the act itself. And that's why the next chapter matters. Because when investigators slowed the footage, frame by frame, they uncovered something chilling about the timing of that shot. Something that suggested this act wasn't just violent. It was orchestrated for maximum symbolic impact. And what they found in that footage will make you question whether coincidence exists at all. Let's slow it down. Kirk leans forward, microphone in hand. A student has just asked about violence. You can hear it in the video, the tone of challenge, the crowd holding its breath for Kirk's response. He starts to answer, his cadence sharp, his voice forceful. And then, crack. The sound is sharp, metallic, almost out of place against the backdrop of murmurs and shuffling chairs. In real time, it's chaos. But in slow motion, it becomes something chillingly precise. The bullet strikes Kirk's neck at the exact syllable where he says the word violence. Think about that. Not before, not after. In the moment he speaks the word itself. Coincidence? Or choreography? Kirk jerks back, his hand flying to his neck. His face twists in shock, not just from pain, but from the surreal irony of the moment. You can almost see it in his eyes. The realization that the very subject of his words has become his reality. Blood begins to flow. Gasps ripple through the tent. The camera shakes as people scream. And in the background, if you listen closely, you can hear chairs scraping, bodies ducking, panicked breaths. But the timing, that timing is what nobody can forget. Because here's the unsettling question. How does a shooter 200 yards away time his shot so perfectly? How does he fire not just into a crowd, but into a man at the very second he's talking about violence? That requires patience, observation, calculation. And that's why investigators began to suspect this wasn't random, that the shooter didn't just aim at Kirk. He aimed at symbolism itself. Now, let's examine the precision. 200 yards is no small distance. That's a professional-level shot. Factors like wind, movement, angle, all have to be accounted for. This wasn't a wild spray of bullets. It was one shot, one target, one neck. Doesn't that feel deliberate? Doesn't that suggest planning? And the fact that the bullet hit just as Kirk spoke about violence? That feels almost theatrical, as though the shooter wanted the moment to be remembered not just as an act of violence, but as a statement about it. Isn't that haunting? Now add this detail. In some videos, you can see Kirk beginning to gesture with his hand, raising it slightly as he makes his point. The bullet strikes just as that hand moves, exposing his neck even more. Almost as if the shooter was waiting for the moment of vulnerability, the split second when Kirk's body position made the shot undeniable. Doesn't that sound like timing beyond chance? For investigators, the footage became both evidence and puzzle. It showed precision, but also intent. It raised the possibility that the act wasn't just about silencing Kirk's voice. It was about creating a grotesque piece of performance art. And that possibility horrified them. Because if the shooter wanted symbolism, if he wanted to tie Kirk's words about violence to the act itself, then this wasn't just violence. This was theater. Theater written in blood. And here's where it gets darker. The shooter's silence after being caught makes more sense in this light. He didn't need to speak. The bullet was his statement. The timing was his message. His silence only amplified it. Do you see the pattern? Kirk talks about violence, bullet answers, shooter silences himself. Speech, violence, silence. A chilling sequence. And here's where we ask the unthinkable. Was the shooter trying to prove a point? Was he trying to show that words no longer matter? That in today's America, bullets drown out microphones? Because if that's the case, then the footage isn't just evidence, it's prophecy. But here's the kicker. In one slowed-down video, just before the shot, Kirk's eyes shift slightly upward, as though he hears or senses something. It's subtle, almost imperceptible, but it suggests he may have felt the moment coming, milliseconds before impact. Was it instinct? Coincidence? Or something else entirely? The footage leaves us with more questions than answers. And the internet, predictably, erupted. Some called it a conspiracy, that the timing was too perfect to be real. Others claimed the shooter must have had training, military or otherwise. And then there were those who said it didn't matter, because the symbolism spoke louder than any motive ever could. But investigators weren't satisfied with speculation. They wanted answers. They wanted to know, was this the work of one bitter man, or was there something larger at play? And when they examined the shooter's precision, his preparation, and his chilling silence, they began to suspect that this wasn't just an act of violence. It was a message, but a message from whom? And to whom? Those were the questions that would lead investigators into even darker territory. Because the next chapter reveals that once the footage went viral, America didn't just see a shooting. It saw a battlefield of interpretation. And what happened online in the hours that followed would turn a tragedy into a national firestorm. And nobody could control it.